The rich man who proposed to me was my ex-boyfriend's father. I nearly ruined 2 families. He got down on one knee in front of everyone at that dinner table, a velvet box in his hand, diamonds catching the light, and the whole room went silent. And I just stood there, frozen, because I recognized his face. Not from a dream, not from a photo. I recognized him because I had sat across from him at another table years ago, the first time Chukwuemeka brought me home to meet his family. That man kneeling before me was his father. He was Chukwuemeka's father. And I had not told a single soul about the history I shared with his son. If you are new here, subscribe before this story ends, because what happens next will shake you in ways you are not ready for. My name is Ifesinachi. I am 31 years old and I am from Nnewi in Anambra State. I grew up in a household where my mother washed other people's clothes to pay our school fees, and my father came home twice a year, sometimes not at all. We were not poor in the way that breaks your spirit, we were poor in the way that makes you angry, the kind of angry that turns into fire if you are not careful. And I was careful. I stayed in school, I read every book I could find, I passed my exams, I got into university on a scholarship that I fought for with everything I had. That is where I met Chukwuemeka Ozuemena. Chukwuemeka was the kind of man women wrote poems about, tall, with a kind of smile that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. He was brilliant too, studying engineering while I was in accounting, and we met during a group project in our second year that neither of us wanted to be part of. He kept stealing glances at me across the library table. I kept pretending not to notice. By the end of that semester, we were inseparable. He was also the kind of man who knew exactly what he was worth. His family was wealthy. Chief Ogeneroro Ozuemenam was a business mogul with properties across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. His mother wore jewelry that cost more than my family's entire compound back in Nnewi. And yet, Chukwuemeka never made me feel small. He never made me feel like I was beneath him. That was what I loved most about him. He saw me clearly and still chose me. We dated for 3 years. 3 years of phone calls that lasted till morning. Of him driving 3 hours to bring me food when I was sick. Of us planning a future that felt so real I could almost touch it. He talked about marriage. He talked about children. He talked about taking me home officially with wine and kola nut and blessings. I believed every single word. Then, his father called him home for the holidays and something shifted. He came back from that trip quieter, shorter with his words. I asked what was wrong and he said nothing, just stressed with school. I believed him for 2 weeks. Then he sat me down at the small restaurant near our faculty where we used to eat pepper soup on Friday evenings, and he told me it was over. Just like that. No real explanation. He said his family had concerns. He said the timing was not right. He said he cared about me deeply, but things were complicated. I asked what concerns, what complications, and he looked away from me and said, Ifesinachi, please do not make this harder than it already is. I went back to my hostel and did not leave my room for 4 days. When I finally came out, I made a decision. I would never again let a man's family be the reason I lost him. I would never again be the girl someone was ashamed to bring home. I poured everything into my studies, graduated with a first class, got a job at an auditing firm in Lagos that paid me more money than I had ever seen, and I did not look back. I did not look back at Nnewi, did not look back at university, and I absolutely did not look back at Chukwuemeka Ozuemenam. 5 years passed. I was doing well. My own flat in Lagos, a car I bought myself, a position at work that my mother cried happy tears on the phone on. I had dated 2 men after Chukwuemeka, both decent, neither right, and I had made peace with the idea that perhaps love was not meant to arrive on a schedule. I was not bitter, I was busy. That was when my colleague Adaora invited me to a charity gala in Victoria Island. Adaora was the kind of woman who collected connections the way other people collected shoes. She knew everyone in Lagos that mattered, and she dragged me to every event she could because, as she put it, "Ifesinachi, your beauty is wasting inside that office." I usually said no. That evening, I said yes because I was tired and bored and figured free food and good music could not hurt. The gala was held at a waterfront hotel I couldn't have afforded to book for a birthday party, the kind of place where the flowers at the entrance cost more than my monthly utilities. I wore a burgundy dress I had bought 6 months ago and never found a reason to put on. And Adaora did my makeup herself, which meant I looked far more dramatic than I intended. Then I saw him across the room. He was older, obviously, grey at his temples now, sharper lines around his jaw, but the posture was unmistakable. The kind of confidence that doesn't come from money alone, but from decades of knowing that every room you enter will rearrange itself around you. Chief Ogeneroro Ozueminam, Chukwuemeka's father, the man I had met once, briefly, at a family lunch during my 3rd year, when Chukwuemeka had brought me home and his father had looked at me with polite, calculating eyes that gave nothing away. I grabbed Adaora's arm and said I needed a drink. I spent the next 40 minutes avoiding him. It wasn't difficult, the room was large, and I was skilled at disappearing into conversations I didn't need to be part of. But then Adaora spotted him, recognized him from a magazine, and decided tonight was the night she would network her way to the top. She pulled me over before I could protest, introduced herself, introduced me, and stood there, smiling like she had just won something. He shook Adaora's hand. Then he turned to me. His eyes stayed on my face 3 seconds longer than was polite. I wondered if he remembered me. 5 years was a long time. I had changed my hair, changed my glasses, changed the way I carried myself entirely. But something in his expression told me he was searching for something he could not quite place. I smiled neutrally and looked away. By the time the evening ended, Adaora had exchanged numbers with half the room, and I had eaten enough small chops to justify my attendance. I thought that was that. 3 days later, Chief Ogeneroro Ozoemenam walked into my office building. He was there for a meeting with one of our senior partners, because of course he was, because Lagos is smaller than it looks when you are trying to avoid someone. I was walking through the lobby with a file in my hand when I heard his voice behind me saying, "Excuse me, Ifesinachi, is it not?" I stopped. I turned slowly. He said he had been thinking since the gala. He remembered me, not from where exactly, but he remembered my face. He said he had asked about me and would like to take me to lunch if I was open to it. I should have said no. I should have said, "Chief, we have met before, and your son broke my heart at a pepper soup joint 5 years ago, and I am absolutely not going to have lunch with you." But I did not say any of that, because something in me was curious, and because I was a fool. We had lunch. Pause right there, because if this story is already making your jaw drop, subscribe right now, because you need to be here for what comes next. Lunch became dinner. Dinner became Sunday visits. Sunday visits became something I could not easily explain to people who asked about my personal life. Chief Ogeneroro, he asked me to call him Ehoro, was attentive in a way I was not accustomed to. He listened when I spoke. He asked questions that told me he had remembered things I said 3 conversations ago. He sent food to my office when I mentioned a deadline. He was careful, deliberate, warm in a way that felt specific to me. And I told myself I had not made the connection. I told myself the name Ozuemenam was common enough that I had not properly connected the dots. That was a lie I was telling myself in a very small voice, while a louder voice knew exactly what was happening. Then the dinner happened. He invited me to his home in Banana Island for what he called a quiet family meal. I told myself it was nothing. I dressed up, I took a cab there. The gate opened and I walked into a compound so large it had its own garden path lined with lights. And standing in the living room, a glass of juice in his hand, looking at his phone, was Chukwuemeka. He looked up when I walked in. The glass nearly slipped from his hand. Neither of us said a word for 3 full seconds. Then Chief Ehororo appeared from the hallway behind me with a wide smile and said, "Chukwuemeka, come and greet my guest properly. This is Ifesinachi." Chukwuemeka looked at his father, then at me, then at his father again. Something moved across his face that I could not fully read. Shock, yes, but also something older underneath it. Something that looked almost like guilt. He extended his hand and said, "We have met before, actually." The room shifted. Chief Ehororo looked between us slowly. He said, "You know each other?" Chukwuemeka said, "From university, just briefly." And I stood there in the middle of that living room, knowing that everything I had avoided naming for 6 weeks had just walked into the light with nowhere to hide. Dinner was the most difficult 2 hours of my life. We sat around that table, 3 of us, with Chief Ehororo talking about his business ventures and asking about my career, while Chukwuemeka sat directly opposite me and barely touched his food. His mother was traveling, his younger sister was at boarding school. It was just the 3 of us, and the silence between me and Chukwuemeka was loud enough that I was certain his father could hear it. When Chief Ehororo excused himself to take a call after dessert, Chukwuemeka leaned across the table and said in a voice so low that it was almost not a voice at all, "You need to tell him." I said, "Tell him what?" He said, "You know what." I said, "Chukwuemeka, your father is a grown man. Whatever is happening between us is between us." He sat back and looked at me with something I had not expected to see on his face. It was not anger, it was pain. He said, "Ifesinachi, I know you think I ended things because of him, but that is not the full story. I ended things because I was a coward, and I have regretted it every single day since. And now my father is sitting in the next room about to tell you that he wants to marry you, and I do not know what to do with that." The world went very quiet. I said, "What did you just say?" He said, "He told me before tonight that he found someone he is serious about. He did not tell me it was you. He thinks he did not know you would know me." I sat with that for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. Chief Ehororo was planning to propose. Chukwuemeka still carried something from me, and I was sitting in the middle of this like a thread that had somehow tied itself around 2 people in the same family without meaning to. Chief Ehororo came back into the room smiling and said, "I hope my son is behaving himself." Chukwuemeka smiled at him, a smile that did not touch his eyes, and said, "Of course, Papa." I went home that night and did not sleep. The next morning, I called Adaora, which was a mistake, because Adaora had opinions about everything and expressed all of them at the same time. She told me I was living inside a Nigerian movie. She told me I needed to leave immediately. She also said Chief Ehororo was a very fine man with many properties and I should think carefully. I hung up on her and called my mother instead. My mother listened to the whole story in silence. Then she said, "Ifesinachi, the question is not which man you want. The question is which version of yourself you can live with." I turned that sentence over for 3 days. Here is what I had not told anyone. Here is the thing that made this more complicated than a love triangle or a family conflict. When Chief Ehoro first started showing interest in me, I had found out quietly through professional circles that Chukwuemeka had broken off a recent engagement. A woman named Onyekachi from a family his father had approved, a match that had been arranged carefully and collapsed suddenly 6 months ago. Nobody in those circles knew exactly why, but I had wondered. And then I met the chief, and I started to wander in a completely different direction. I called Chukwuemeka. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. I asked him why he had ended his engagement to Onyekachi. He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, because I was still in love with someone else. I did not ask him to clarify. I already knew. I asked him instead, does your father know what we were to each other? Truly? He said no. When he ended things with me 5 years ago, he had told his father only that things did not work out. His father never knew the full weight of what had existed between us. He never knew that his son had walked away from a woman he loved deeply and then spent 5 years carrying that decision like a stone around his neck. And his father had gone out into the world and found the same woman. I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and thought about what a strange curved thing fate could be. Not romantic movie fate, the real kind, the kind that does not come with music, the kind that just shows up and sits across from you and asks you what you are going to do now. I made my decision. I called Chukwuemeka. I told him I needed to speak with his father. He asked what I would say. I told him I was going to tell the truth, all of it, from the beginning, without leaving out the parts that were uncomfortable. He went quiet again. Then he said, thank you. I called Chief Ehoro and asked to see him. He sounded pleased. I spent that whole next day practicing what I would say, then abandoning every version because no version sounded the way I wanted it to. I arrived at his house. His staff brought tea. He sat across from me looking like a man who had decided he was happy, and something in that made what I was about to do feel heavier. I told him everything. I told him about university, about Chukwuemeka, about 3 years of a relationship that meant everything to me and ended without adequate explanation. I told him about the gala, about recognizing his face across the room. I told him I had not been honest about what I knew, and I was sorry for that. I told him his son was still in love with me and had been for years, and that I was telling him this not to embarrass anyone, but because he deserved to make whatever choices came next with all the information I had. I told him I could not in good conscience accept a proposal from a man whose son's heart I was still untangling myself from. He listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, the room was very still. He set down his cup carefully. He looked at me for a long time with those thorough, calculating eyes. Then he said, "You are an honest woman, Ifesinachi, and I am a man who has made many decisions in his life based on incomplete information. I am grateful I did not make this one." He did not cry. He wasn't that kind of man. But something in his face settled into a grief that was quiet and dignified and very real. He called Chukwuemeka the next morning. I was not there for that conversation. Chukwuemeka told me about it later in halting sentences, his voice thick. He said his father asked him why he had not been brave enough 5 years ago. He said his father told him fear was the only sin he could never forgive in a man who had every advantage in life. He said his father cried, and Chief Ogenero Ozoemenam was by all accounts a man who had not cried since his own father's burial. Chukwuemeka came to me with his father's blessing, not because his father was not hurt, not because any of this was clean or neat or without damage, but because Chief Ehoro understood after everything, that he had built his entire life on the principle that truth was the only currency that never devalued. He told his son, "Go and fix what you broke." Chukwuemeka and I did not rush anything. The easy version of this story would have us falling back into each other's arms as if 5 years had not passed, as if the leaving had not happened, as if I did not have feelings that were more complicated than simply forgiving someone who once made me cry for 4 days inside a hostel room. We talked. We argued actually, about the things he had never explained properly and the ways I had packed those unanswered questions into my chest and carried them so long that they started to feel like part of my anatomy. He told me the truth, finally. His family had been pressuring him, not his father specifically, but an uncle, a grandmother, a network of opinions about what kind of woman was appropriate for a man of their standing. He was young and afraid, and he had chosen the path of least resistance instead of choosing me. He was not proud of it. He said he had not been proud of it for 5 years. I told him being sorry and being forgiven are two arrivals, and they don't always come on the same day. He said he knew. We gave it time, real time, not the movie kind. 14 months later, he brought palm wine and kola nut to my mother's house in Newi, with his family behind him. The same grandmother who had once been part of the chorus of disapproval sat in my mother's parlor looking at my mother's face and finding, apparently, what she had once told her grandson was not there to find. My mother poured the drink herself. Her hands did not shake once. Chief Ehoro did not attend that visit, but he sent his blessing through Chukwuemeka with a handwritten letter that Chukwuemeka pressed in my hand the night before. In that letter, he said he bore me no bitterness. He said I hope I would be happy. He said that the most important lesson his own father ever taught him was that a man's dignity was not in never being wrong, but in what he did when he found out he was. He said he was grateful I did not make the mistake of marrying a woman whose heart was not entirely available to him. He signed it, with respect and sincerity, Chief O. Ozuemenam. I folded that letter and kept it in a small box, where I keep the things that remind me who I am. Because that is what this story is actually about. It is not about romance or who ended up with whom. It is about a moment I had to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be when the easier thing and the right thing were standing in completely different directions. It would have been easy to say nothing. It would have been easy to accept that proposal and rewrite my history in real time. No one who did not already know would ever have found out. I could have told myself I deserved it. I could have told myself this was just life circling back to give me something it owed me. But I knew. And knowing and choosing silence anyway is not fate. It is just a different kind of cowardice. My mother used to say that when a thread tangles, you don't pull it harder. You find the original knot and you start there. I found the knot. I untangled it with my own hands, even when those hands were shaking. And everything that is now woven into my life, the man beside me, the family that finally accepted me, the peace I carry into every room I enter, was built on that one decision to tell the truth when lying would have been far easier. If this story reached something inside you, if it made you think about a knot you have been pulling instead of untangling, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Because every story here is told the same way I told this one, without cutting the parts that are hard, without rushing the parts that matter, and without ever letting the truth get left out just because it's uncomfortable. Subscribe to Echoes of African's Truth and stay with us. The next story is already waiting for you.